Okay, let's start. I'm Lynn March. I'm facilitating or moderating this mob. One of the first things we might have to decide, are we the composite workshop or are we the composite workshop? But we don't have a polling for that, but I think we're the composite working group. Okay, we see all the wonderful people who've been contributing to this so far, and some of them are on the panel, and we'll introduce them as we go, and some that couldn't be with us, but particularly Sarah couldn't come, Lauren couldn't come, but I think the others you'll meet. We've got everyone else there. Okay, so the first up to introduce us to the composites and what we're here for is George Wells. George is a guru of methods of OMERACT since forever, since the year dot. But his fun fact is he's remarried and now between them have a Brady bunch of grandchildren. They've got 5 together, and he's bought a property and he's going to renovate right across the other side of the country so he could be near his grandchildren.
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, so my purpose here is to introduce the idea of composites. So my very first question is, what is a composite? And I'm going to give you a picture, and I'm going to talk about that picture in a few minutes, and here's the picture. And I'll explain it a little bit more later in detail. But just to the right of that picture, you'll notice the OMERACT way for composites. And what I just want to take you through is the 6 components that are there so that you will fully understand the various steps that we go through. And the very first one is to define your concept. Okay, so a composite is about capturing a target concept. And that requires you to bring things together so that you can describe and get at that target concept in an adequate and a way to capture it. And there's various target concepts we're interested in. We're interested in disease activity, flare, remissions, response, and a number of others. So first thing we have to do is define the concept. The second thing we have to do is we have to bring these things together that are going to define it. And these things are the domains. And then so we have to derive our set of domains. And you can follow the OMERACT way of deriving those domains. So those domains could be part of the inner onion, or they could be in the outer parts of the onion, or they could even be outside the onion. The third step is to measure it. So we like to get an instrument that will do a quality job on measuring that domain. And these instruments, again, we could follow the OMERACT way to do that. And these instruments could be of various types. They could give you a discrete outcome, a binary if you wish. It could be a continuous outcome. The next step in the process is to weigh the domains. Okay, so we're bringing different things together to be able to adequately capture that target concept. And the question is that we want to bring them together so that the relative importance or the weight, okay, of the domains are properly and adequately represented within the composite. Okay, and there's so many ways that we can do it. In fact, one of our remits of the group is to come up with a catalog of the different ways of doing this, and you're going to see some of those over the next hour or so. And then after we have the composite, we can put it through the filter. Okay, so just like any idea and process that we have in OMERACT, we want to move it through the filter 2.2, and then we bring it to a vote. So those are the last 2 components on the OMERACT way for composites. So that brings us back to this. Okay, this composite picture. Actually, this composite was from the first OMERACT 1, if you wish. It didn't have a number back then, but it was over 30 years ago. And just to shed you a little bit of light, I'm going to open the umbrella and take a look inside what that brown package contains. And then
George, what is under the umbrella?
Come here, Cos, come here. Oh, this is great. How are you?
Well, but I'm so excited. What is under the umbrella?
This is your first manifestation. This is your first manifestation, Cos. Let me show you what's under the umbrella. There is your first corset. Your first corset. You got swollen joints. You got tender joints. You got pain. You got inflammation. You got all the things you like. Yes, that's the onion. The first onion is all there.
It's great.
Neat? That's
It's super great.
And you know what we did, Cos?
What?
We did something with the onion. We did something with that corset. And let me show you. Okay, here it is. This is what's on your body. You got joint tenderness, swollen joints. You got patient global, physician global. You got pain. You got disability. And you've got inflammation, right? And what we did was we decided these were the core outcomes that we wanted to be in that onion, all right? And then what we did was we measured them. And these are the different measurements, okay, of that outcome domain. But then the magic begins, because what we wanted to do, all the intention of going across here was to look at response. Okay, we wanted to come up with response. We had to pull and push these things together, and we had to come up with a different manifestation for you. So that's what we did. And we came up with this equation, but this is the best way of looking at it. In fact, let me just show you here. I got something in my bag. I did this because I thought you may be coming, which I think is great. So what we did in this response, we wanted to take tender joint counts. And we thought a good response was to at least get 20%. All right? And then we did swollen joint counts.
Yes.
And we wanted to make sure that that was 20%. Now, these were two very important ones, and we actually decided that through those cards I showed you that were in the envelope. That they were the cards, and we went through a process. We felt that these two were really important and should be always included. Okay, but we did have some that were not as important. Well, they're important, but you didn't have to have them all. Okay, and there's 5 of these, but you only had to have 3 of them being under 20%. So I'll just put them up on you. Pain. Patient global. I'll put physician global right over your heart.
Exactly.
Physician global. And then we've got physical function. Where am I going to put it, Cos? How about here?
Yeah.
I don't want to get too personal. And then the last one is inflammation, 20%. Okay, so we did all this.
It's really inflamed.
Okay, here we go. Right there. All right. So we put all these things together because, number one, we thought these were the important domains and things to look at. We wanted to look at response in rheumatoid arthritis. We decided on these particular instruments because we thought they would be good instruments to capture those domains. And then we had to come up with a process using those cards on how to make everything together. And when we did that, what we derived was the ACR20 response criteria for rheumatoid arthritis. Isn't that neat? We've taken your body parts and we moved, actually, take off that hat. We're going to reward you with a new hat, which is the ACR 20 hat, which of course is a Colorado version, and there you go. All right, so if I can put, you look pretty good. You look pretty good. No, you can't drop corset. Well, maybe they're the 2 of the 5 that
I
you
only
can.
need 3,
You only
so I
need
don't
3.
know.
You only need 3. We planned that, yeah. Okay, so what I would like you to do, well, you know, I felt really bad because I really wanted to, just in case you were here, to bring you that umbrella. But this umbrella was the token. You know, right now you have a lip balm that's this big and it'll fit in your pocket. We had this umbrella that was this long, thanks to the organizers, in particular Dr. Boers, for giving us this big umbrella that looked like a tulip. Took us forever to get it up into the overhead bin on the airplane. And I was thinking of bringing it, but it doesn't fit in carry-on luggage. And also probably today is probably considered to be a weapon. Okay, so I couldn't bring that. Maybe we'll email it to you. But I would like you to stay here if you can,
Okay.
because we're going to be taking different versions of you and doing different things to you, and you should be aware of it.
Okay,
All
I will
right?
be sitting here.
You're going to be there. Oh, you dropped the important one.
No, that's important. I should not lose this one.
Okay, thank you for your attention, and I'll pass it back to our facilitator.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much to George and Onion. Then next up we have, whoops, Martin de Witt is going to come to speak to you. And Martin's fun fact, Martin was our original PRP leader and first PRP that we had on the executive, and opened many doors to the patient research partner program now. But on Thursdays he likes to eat fish and mayonnaise with his 3-year-old grandson. And they walk to the fish shop and they don't even have chips. He eats the fish without the chips and have a lovely talk, and then they walk home again.
Thank you, Lynn. I have been involved in GRAPPA and also in the discussions around composite measures within psoriatic arthritis. That's a condition that I have. And right from the start, I've been very interested in these composites. And I think specifically for PSA, we need these instruments because it's a very heterogeneous disease. As you can see here, it can have uveitis, spine involvement, enthesitis, dactylitis, nail involvement, joints, skin. So it's quite a broad range of symptoms. And of course, when we got involved in this, as a patient, we were asked to help to make the domain match and advise researchers what is a good composite instrument. So that made me also think about what to expect from these instruments. And of course, we want to have not only a very good assessment of all the individual domains, but would it not be nice if you also have a general outcome of the disease? How are you doing? So that you also can compare over time. But then, of course, the question for us is also, what do you expect? Is that a measure for disease activity? Is it disease impact? Of course, quality of life is important for us. So these are all items that would be nice to have in one outcome. But of course, also it should not lump everything together. And we had also with the patient discussions at a particular moment where we looked at what's happening if you lump everything together. And if you have high joint involvement and actually no skin involvement, you measure both, you count them, you take the mean, and then you end up with, well, you have moderate disease. But that's not how we experience then that condition. So there are some things that we need to discuss. And that's also similar for the weighting, but George also just explained. And then identification of domains that are only relevant and important for a minority of patients, because that is specific for them. For instance, nail involvement. It's very important for patients who have severe appearance of bad nails. So how to incorporate that? We have a domain set. This is endorsed in 2016. And as you can see, it is the joints, it includes skin activity, pain, patient global, physical function, health-related quality of life, fatigue, and systematic inflammation. So in an ideal world, you may expect that there is a composite that nicely measures all these domains. But there is not. But there are many instruments, many composites that are used in psoriatic arthritis. And when over the years, I've tried to make sense of all the different instruments. And being a member of this working group, I also now started to look at what are the target concepts that all these different instruments measure. And that's very difficult because I don't see that there is any logic in all of these instruments. Why not? Well, these are the instruments, these are the domains in the red box that are important for people with psoriatic arthritis. Composite indices, they measure all a different number of items. So if you look at the 7 that are, I counted the number of domains, and you see that it varies. For the rapid 3, only measuring 3 domains, and then if you go up, and you look at the grays, is measuring 6 domains. Of course, as I said, all these composite indexes measure the OMERACT core set. The OMERACT core set are the elements that you see here in the blue boxes. And if you look at the instruments each, you can also see that there is a variety in numbers of domains that are from the core set. So there is only one that has that measure only 2 of the core domains, and the grays again has 7 domains that are also included in the core set. So then, fatigue is one of the 8 items in the core set, but it's not measured in any of the composites. So now the working group, the PSA working group, the OMERACT working group, together with CRAPA, is assessing all the different composites. And it's fascinating because we want to understand what is the differences between. We have to select which one we are going to recommend, but they are all different. In this one here, you see that with the green pawns are the ones that have been decided, now selected, to go through the OMERACT filter. So there are 5. But they also added the ACR, response criteria. While we actually all think that in a disease like PSA, you should not use, that's my opinion, an instrument that comes for RA, because I already know now it doesn't measure skin, for instance, and also other elements. So that is a little bit strange, in my opinion. Also, there are some instruments that, and this is a result of a consensus meeting, where 2 of the ones that are now going to be tested were not recommended for clinical trials. The RAPID-3 and the 3VAS, you can see they were clearly recommended for clinical practice, and they should not be used in clinical trials. And then finally, I think it's also important to realize that all these instruments were not only developed before the OMERACT recommendations how to do this, they were actually, most of them, also developed without any input of patients. So I think we have quite a difficult job, challenging job, also for us as patients to understand the instrument and then to come up with an informed opinion, which one we would like to see. So there's a lot of confusion and need to think this further. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Martin. Next up, we have Sam Samballo and Francis Gilmer doing a duo, yes? A duet or a duo. So Sam and Francis actually met about 30 years ago. Sam is the professor of linguistics at the university. Francis coming to perfect his English in the class. And then some years later, Francis is running the koala cohort, the neo-OA cohort. He sees the name of the participant, Sam, and invited him, and then the rest is history, as they say. He's been translating and back-translating our OA flare questionnaires and been our patient partner ever since. So thank you, Sam.
Well, thank you. But we will start by leaving the 20th century and coming back to this present century. And, well, we'll start with...
Thank you, Lynn, for the very nice introduction. The story of flares in OA began during a clinical trial meeting in a hospital in Sydney, when a participant raised a word of flares occurring the follow-up of osteoarthritis patients in this clinical trial, and said they had quite a lot of difficulty to capture it appropriately. This triggered me some questions on how such flare phenomenon could be measured in this OA condition in a standardized way, And I proposed to think of a project to conceptualize and design such a measure. David Hunter was the PI of this clinical trial, explained he was a sort of a peripatetic thinker. So he offered me to go outside and walk around the rugby field nearby to build on this idea. And after 3/4 of an hour of strenuous walking exercise, he's a tall guy, a decision was made and a protocol for developing such an instrument was born.
So domains were identified and characterized through an inductive approach, starting from the patients on the one hand and from health professionals on the other hand, and building up from the data they offered. To determine the criteria for the characterization of flares, patients were interviewed first freely, then in a semi-structured approach. The patients were contacted in Australia and France. 10 patients in the first phase, 29 in the second, in semi-structured interviews, plus 10 patients in a focus group and all involving the 2 languages. Similarly, 16 health professionals were interviewed in both Australia and France. Their responses were analyzed to extract recurrent preoccupations and questionings. Statements were grouped together into first 9 domains, which were then downsized to 7 through the reducing of content redundancy. The domains went through a Delphi consensus selection process involving 50 patients and 116 health professionals from 17 countries and 4 continents. 5 domains remain that were presented for endorsement in a virtual meeting as part of OMERACT 2020. The 5 domains were endorsed, and they are pain, swelling, stiffness, psychological aspects, and impact of symptoms.
The definition of the domains is on screen, and you can read it. Pain during flares is a pain that is more severe and lasts longer, that is particularly heightened with physical activity and persists with rest. Swelling during a flare is a new increase in size or feeling of fullness of the joint. Stiffness during flare are an increased or prolonged stiffness of the joint that does not improve with movement. It's particularly true for knee, of course. Psychological aspects during a flare are alterations in mood, including depressive symptoms, greater anxiety, greater irritability, and or low morale that are consequences of the symptoms during flare. And what we labeled impact of symptoms was a change in the ability to perform daily activities, requiring new adaptation and strategies due to the pain, swelling, and stiffness of the flare.
Parallel to the definition of domains, work progress on the definition of an instrument to measure the domains, the Flare in OA questionnaire. Patients with knee and or hip osteoarthritis in Australia and France were interviewed in their own language. With their 180 statements as a starting point, several steps were taken to reduce the number of relevant and agreed on items by Delphi process. 398 patients were involved in the study for validation of the psychometric properties of the questionnaire, resulting in a 16-item questionnaire with good validity and scaling properties. Mining 3 databases, PubMed, Web of Science, and PsycInfo, over the 2017-2021 period, led to the identification of 5 self-report questionnaires on hip and knee osteoarthritis as potential candidate instruments. From 575 references identified, 59 were selected as pertinent for the study. The reasons for the exclusion were varied. Either they did not concern hip or knee, they did not mention measurement, or they did not concern self-report. These 59 publications yielded 12 questionnaires matching the OMERACT domain definitions. And in turn, these 12 were evaluated through a Delphi process. 5 questionnaires came out of the Delphi sifting. These were submitted to the appreciation of the Flares in a Way working group, who fully endorsed the Flare in a Way questionnaire in a plenary voting session. Once we are at this stage, reaching a composite rendering of the disease requires one major step, allotting a different weight to each of the identified domains according to the importance we give them in the characterization of the disease. And now, dear OMERACtors, we thank you for your attention and we'll move along to the practical side of this session.
Thank you, Sam and Francis. And now we've played the dating game, but now what you've all been waiting for is the waiting game. So Dorcas Beaton is going to explain her game and the beads. And Dorcas, as many of you know, loves dogs, and she has Nova Scotia duck tolling retrievers. And I had to look that up, what they, but if you want to find out more what they actually do, have to talk to Dorcas.
And I'm sure many of you met my duck tolling retrievers. If you have been on a Zoom call with me, they bark a lot. But, okay, so now it's time to get into some action for you. And you may have noticed, don't start rattling around, there's some things on the table in front of you that are in the OMERACT colors too. So what we've done is we've taken the domains from the FLAIR questionnaire, and we know that the FLAIR group, and if you're at the SIG, you know how much work they've done beyond their domains and instrumentation. They've done really complex weighting, but we thank them very much for pausing in their process so that we can engage you in a weighting game. So what we'd like you to do is really try to think about weighting, because weighting in a composite, when you have a composite, it has a set of weights. And those weights could have been derived in a lot of different ways and could have been a lot of different weights for each of the domains. So we want to take you through an exercise where you think about, well, how much variation would there be? How much importance is the actual weighting process? Every instrument, be it a composite or even a summary score, is weighted. Sometimes they're weighted by 1, so we don't see the weights per se. But the composites, we make those weights explicit. And it's a critical part in the development to be explicit about the weights and to do that carefully. So the goal of today is to get some experience weighting. We're borrowing the domains, and it's important to realize there's no real right or wrong in doing this. We just want you to try it and to work as a group. Now, the task. You have a sheet in front of you that looks like this. And first we ask you to please identify if you're a PRP or not, and then what table number you're at, those little wooden signs. If you're missing anything, just sit still for a bit and we will get it to you. Folks, no, everybody sit, we'll get you sheets. Just let us know. I shouldn't have said just everybody sit. No, it's okay. Okay. Yes, but Shauna can do that too. We need more sheets at the different tables. Okay, so the first task you're going to do, is to rank those domains. It'll be tricky to get through this if people can't hear the instructions. Okay. So you're going to rank the domains from 1 to 5 in terms of what you think is the most important domain for the concept of FLAIR. Okay? And so that's just to get your mind thinking about ranking. Now, individual, you do this on your own, not as a table. Thank you, George. The definitions are on the back of your sheet if you want to refer to them. After you've done the ranking, I'm going to go through all the instructions. After you've done the ranking, this is the tricky part. We want you to assign a weight. Now, there's little packages of beads on your little individual packages. There's 20 beads for each domain in each of the packages. So make sure you have a package for each of your domains. And then you're going to be assigning. So you're working as an individual to assign your weights. And then you'll find a string on your table. Take one of the strings and load your weights on that string. Once everybody's done that at your table, we would like you to do that as a group, okay? So the whole table is going to come to a decision of one set of weights. This is now a really critical step. Shh. Once your whole table has come to a decision about that set of weights, please put a second strand of beads on the other side of the O on your bracelet that reflects your group weights. Now here's the prize, Cause. I'm wondering if I can get Cause to go to the back of the booth, because as your group finishes this task and has their weights, you go back and give that weight to Cause, that set of weights. The first 3 groups that get to the back with their weights get a prize for their table. A little incentive. And you'll see the weights coming up. Any questions or panel? Anything? One person per table goes back and gives the weights.
Look at the tables now. Look at the results on the slide. What do you think? You know, if we look at the different domains, we will not make any average of this, but we are, with no surprise, with some degree of heterogeneity between the tables. You already had long discussions at tables because you had heterogeneity within your group of tables. So this is, with no surprise, between tables, there's still some heterogeneity. So there are several types of comments that we can do from this table. There is, first of all, it looks like there is a tendency that pain comes first in many, many ways, in many, many tables, most of them, I think. They are but they are equals one. Then the next one would be probably the impact of symptoms, which means that the 3 other ones came in the other rank. So impact of symptoms, it's more general. You know, you had the definition and you are encompassing all the symptoms in this reflection. So it's interesting. But still, there is some variability with up to 7, but down to 3, which means that some tables were putting extreme, for instance, the table who put 8 on pain and 3 of impact on symptoms is putting 3 everywhere. So only pain is emerging, and all of the other one are on equal weight. It could be like if you say it's equal 1 on all, except for 1. So something is emerging there. What about psychological aspects? Psychological aspects seems to be among the lowest, but if I would do, it's very homogeneous, you know, 3, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3, 2, 3. So it means that you have an important weight given to this compared to other dimensions where some tables put 1, like sometimes swelling or sometimes stiffness. So swelling and stiffness is the most heterogeneous, probably, because it ranks from 1 to 5 for swelling, and stiffness, it's a bit more homogeneous, 3 to 4 in most of them. So the question that comes with such a results is, what are we going to do with that? If we want to have a standardized instrument, and we want to have a weight that reflects the community and reflects the individual suffering of patients, it's extremely complex. We have to deal with such a heterogeneity all the time. The point is, the exercise today was to transform an implicit approach that we do every day in making decisions about the different domains of our lives, here particularly in FLAIR, but it could be other different domains, into a unique decision, go for treatment, don't go for treatment, go to doctor, don't go to doctor, take this treatment longer, stop this treatment, etc., etc., etc. So how can we reflect in a single instrument a weighting and a composite score that will be manageable and amenable for reflection of the current state of the patient? You could say, oh, it's simple, now let's take the mean of all of this. But this is not the mean of the tables. Maybe some tables make a calculation. How many tables make just an arithmetical calculation? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So you mostly make an average. Interesting. But still, it reflects heterogeneity between the table. How did the other one? How many tables did a consensus discussion? 1, 2. Hey, you're playing double. 3, 4. Yeah, you can do it, of course. Some did the both. But maybe you arrived to a arithmetic calculation after a consensus approval. Okay. Now, there are more difficult questions to answer that cannot be answered in public, like how many leaders in your group were taking the lead and impose on you the discussion? Of course, no one will raise their hand, except if you have a terrible relationship with this guy. But it's true. That's what happens frequently. You know, and we know many ways in. Yeah, absolutely. You will. Yeah, and? Do you want to take it? No, give your version. Give your interpretation.
Well within the confidence intervals. So there is no heterogeneity at all.
If you are a mathematical approach, you're right. I'm an epidemiologist, I know.
Mathematical, no statistical. I mean, this is random noise that we're seeing here. And you can say, well, those stupid statisticians, they're always talking about noise.
No.
But I'm not a statistician, I'm still saying it.
Yeah, it's not the point. It's not the point. It is, and thank you for raising the point, because it could be said, indeed, if you do stats, that it is just random around a tendency. Agree with that. Remember, I started with that. But the point is, if you go into details, you see some variations. And these variations will not be reflected in a single composite algorithm. And that's what we have to deal with.
The issue, one of the main purposes to do a composite is to increase the signal over noise. So if the noise is actually important, which there could be scenarios where the noise is important, then you should certainly not be doing a composite.
Indeed. A composite that will not reflect this important heterogeneity is necessary and limited. I agree. George, you want to comment?
I would say that the heterogeneity should be in the different target domain that you want to include the heterogeneity of different domains. But the noise of each domains should be reduced to the minimum in a composite score. But if you want to see one of the domain up, you have not to use the composite.
Okay.
So you've gone through an exercise. You see the kind of the thought process that you have to put in when you look at the domains. You went through the beads to try to make a decision on personally how you would weight the various outcomes. In this particular case, the pain, swelling, stiffness, psychological aspects, and impact of symptoms. And then you came to a consensus, one way or the other, averaging it, using logistic regression or whatever you did at your table. And it's very interesting. I went to the FLAIR OA group the other day, and Jonathan Epstein? Yeah, he laid out the plans that the OA FLAIR group went through when they were looking at the weighting. He talked about the simple things, about averaging or taking standardized scores and summing those or averaging those. He talked about the various judgments and discrete choice experiments that they could go through. He talked about pure statistical methods, of which I listed some there, regression models, factorial models, and rash models. And I believe that they've looked at it in different ways. And if I ask Francis, you've taken the rash model, I understand. Is that correct? And they did that for certain distributional properties of the composite. Okay, so that's one example. And I think that our whole group, I thought you guys would perfectly blow it. You didn't. I thought that Dorcas explained it quite well, and that's why everything worked out. I hope you got all your bracelets, and we thank you for that exercise. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to our facilitator, because what you're going to see now is another group, okay, looking at vasculitis, associated vasculitis, and what they did.
So we have Peter Merkel and Gunnar Thomason, and their interesting fact is that Gunnar was a fellow about 100 years ago with Peter Merkel.
And we're still talking. So I'm going to be very brief, and then Gunnar's going to talk about our waiting. We have our slides somewhere? There we are. Okay, yes. So we are developing, as I said earlier, a response criteria for ANCA-associated vasculitis, the correct term for the disease, with hopefully support and endorsement by OMERACT, ACR, and EULAR. And this is an example of this is just the people I wanted to highlight. This is a group that's been working for some time together, and we also have an expert panel that includes 15 additional members. That's actually important because we have more patients in addition to our main patient partners. We have more patients, and we have people of different specialties, and that's important when it comes to the waiting and sort of the voting of the waiting. And I want to particularly highlight our very hardworking fellows who are part of us and our great patient partners as well. So the expert panels, actually adding that was important for each part of this process, even before we got to the waiting. So we have, through a lot of work and process, we've ended up with, depends how you count, 4 criteria or more than 4 criteria within our composite. We have one, which is the BVAS, which is any version of the BVAS, which is a instrument to measure disease activity. It's a standard instrument. And we have 3 levels of it that we want to test to see if the weights will be importantly different. BVAS of 0, BVAS of 1 or 0, believe it or not, those both have been used in trials, or reduction by 50%. Resolution of all major manifestations. This is dichotomous, it's yes or no. Patient global assessment, and this is, again, we're going to look at this at various different levels to see if there should be different weights as we approach that. And then no progression of disease-related damage, which is an interesting concept to bring in, and that will also be dichotomous. So these are moderately different parts, which of course is the idea in a composite, and we try to bring them together as these were the important things. Again, I would remind, this is about waiting, but one of the lessons we've like to make sure everyone knows is just because you have X, Y, Z, and Q in your composite doesn't mean you can't measure P and K in your trial. And so this is where we're at. So Gunnar.
Yeah, so we are at the stage of having to now spread the beans across these criteria. We have not done that yet. And as you have just experienced, that can be done in several ways. It is possible, we think, that some of our criteria get no beans and therefore drop out. We are planning to use a method called Paprika, or it stands for potentially all pairwise rankings of possible alternatives. There are several names for this technique or related technique: multi-criteria decision-making, conjunct analysis, discrete choice analysis, as was brought up earlier this morning. We use the 1000-mind software, and instead of thinking about all the criteria at the same time, we focus on comparing 2 at a time. So this is a kind of a screenshot from a 1000-minds exercise. And in this question, the participant is asked to compare BVAS versus patient global. And by comparing which scenario represents greater treatment response in ANCA vasculitis, reaching BVAS down to 1 or less, and having reduction in patient global by 50 points, versus the other scenarios reaching BVAS even further down to 0, but a less response in the patient global by 30 points. And the participants could choose the one scenario, the one to the left or to the right, or they could conclude that this was equal. This can be done individually, and also people can do it using consensus approach. And I think that this is very important to consider, especially for those who just are going to average out the presentees in the decision making. Who has the vote? How do we balance the opinions of different voters? Some tables might have mainly PRPs, other tables might have no PRPs, and there might be different stakeholders. So that is, of course, very much directs the final weighting. So we are planning to have all members of expert panel do this together, working through the pairwise comparison. We will start by doing it individually and see how the votes go, and then find the resolution on how to, what the response should be for each of the scenarios, and then use the 1000 Minds software to generate weights based on that. So, thank you for.
George is going to do a quick wrap up, and then we're going to do Q&A. Q&A now. Okay. All right. Okay. Oh, you changed it. Thank you. All right. But I haven't got the answers, so I don't know why I'm going to be standing up here, but I'm going to direct it. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, so I thought it was very interesting that you did, Gunnar, mention the patient research partners at the end in terms of who has more of the vote, and back to Martin's question, but we didn't talk about that at all with the OA flare. So we did try at our table, and that wasn't mentioned as one of the comments. So this is maybe not as much of a question as it is a comment, that when we weren't quite sure, we used the patient research partner votes to actually make the final determination on what the score should be. So I just wanted to make that comment, whether or not that's what gets done in vasculitis or not. I know there can be, we had maybe more of a simple task, and this was just a fun exercise, but just a thought in how that might be put together.
I just want to, I don't think this is on, but we found that going through the process, when we had our first initial expert panel meeting with patients and other stakeholders, that, well, it was a long meeting, it was 2 days. By the end of it, most of us, I think everybody had changed their mind to some extent about something. And I think going through a modified nominal group where everyone gets to have a chance to talk was very useful. And I think not just because they heard the weight, if you will, that people applied to things, but they heard the rationale for why that was the case. And so you can put up something like the accumulation of damage, and people have this idea, but when you discuss what that means and why people think that might be important, it made a big difference, because it hadn't previously been part of things we regularly mentioned. And so I think it gives everybody, and then as a facilitator, when I was doing this, you have to make sure that the PRPs and the non-PRPs and the quiet people get the same time and voice, and you tell ahead of time, we're going to call on you, we're going to ask, and it's people begin to step up, and the people who like to dominate can be reined in a bit by doing that. And I think the other thing we did is that those of us who already had ideas and thinking about it, is you go last, or not at all.
Yeah, a lot of comments at the back.
Right. Need a mic. We only have one.
I just wanted to echo that worked very well when we did nominal group technique in developing our core domain set for psoriatic arthritis as well.
Okay, another question? Yep.
This strategy to weight is only based on the panel opinion, so the discrete choice strategy. Do you plan to confront those weights with data? So to have a data-driven analysis? Because, for example, a 50% improvement of PGA could be preferred by the panel, but it could be very rare in clinical trials. And so the responder criteria could be not efficient to detect a difference between the two groups.
Let Gunnar answer.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we of course plan to validate the measure, and we have to start somewhere in what weight we will assign to each of the criteria. But I foresee that that this will be revised, and the weights might get recalibrated if this gets to be used in trials to kind of optimize their performance.
Okay.
Yeah, mine is more of a
An
comment.
additional answer I can give to
Oh.
Divi is that it will be, if indeed, very interesting to compare what will came out of this weighting exercise from the tables of experts compared to what the stats have done, because the stats were based on other kind of data, individual data, and were manipulating completely differently. Despite the comment from Martin, there is a difference in the way it was generated, so it's interesting to compare.
I will say that I went around all the tables and I said, how are you achieving consensus? And half the tables, they may have been, but they said, well, we're fighting. And I think that's might work for this, but it's not really the ideal approach.
No.
David?
Yeah, I was just wanting to make a comment on the partial profile that was shown using discrete choice. While that will provide you an estimate of the individual weights, it creates a little bit of a black box around how other items will inform the decision of the expert in eliciting what preferences they give to each of the items. And so as part of a validation process, in addition to the partial profile, which is the comparison items you have, and assuming all other items are constant, but you need also a full profile where all of your comparisons are also there, and you do a ranking, and you have to correlate how each of them compare, the full profile and the partial profile. That is a more robust evidence to be able to provide the weights. And the second thing is that you're looking at two cohorts.
Can you speak in the microphone, please?
You're looking at two cohorts here, and we're looking at the content that is very important to experts and as well as important to patients. And so it would be nice to see how you elicit the preferences from patients and see how they weight it, and you see how experts weight it and compare. And so you can see how much of preferences you give. But if you approach it as a group without necessarily separating the preferences from patients, it might create a lot of noise in how much total weight you give to a particular item. And I want to believe that you want to give a lot of voice to patients, and so I would suggest that you receive their responses separately for patients and as well for experts. Thank you.
I think that's a very good point. I think it gets down to, you could try to figure this mathematically, but it's empiric. How do you weight patient's voice for not content person versus expert, prevalence, et cetera. But what we hope to do when we do this exercise is listen to all the voices and take notes and keep track. And if there's sometimes disagreement, but it's mild disagreement. But if there's a strong faction of, let's say, 30%, if they're all from one stakeholder group, you note that and you think about that and you see how that changes. And if they're mixed, it's different again. The question is, what do you do with that information? And it's not clear. The group could take it under advisement and then say, which often is, well, if such and so feels that way, I could be a little more like this. Or we thought about rerunning the models and trying it different ways to see if it actually makes a difference if you change the weights. But I don't know if there's a clear answer. Does anyone have a way of resolving that? Except for listening is probably a good idea.
Just a quick comment. Thank you for this observation. I agree with it. But there are several stakeholders in our experiment, and there are very few patients, 5 patients and 20 physicians. But there is more difference in the opinion of rheumatologist versus nephrologist rather than when comparing physician versus patients. So there is the patients are not all delivering the same opinion.
I can say that for certainty, as I am married to a nephrologist. It's remarkable how often she's wrong.
I think we've got a question up the back. Yep. Thank you.
Hello, great discussion. My question is, if I'm designing a composite outcome and I want to include elements of imaging, clinical, and patient, all into a single composite outcome, is there any unique points I need to bear in mind when I include the imaging domain, i.e. does the weighting needs to be a bit more prominent, less prominent, or how do I decide that? Because obviously I'm from an imaging bias, if you like, and I feel very strongly that B should have a higher weighting. And I just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
I think the answer to that excellent question, while asking, are we allowed to mix very different things, is about content validity. It means if you want to make a composite outcome, it should focus on what it measures and what it reflects as a unique object. So in theory, we call that a latent trait. Like, for instance, the health is a latent trait. Health is not measurable by itself. You need different, it's the broad concept. So if you restrict your approach to a unique content, well delimited, with a good definition, that's the rationale for doing a composite outcome. If it's not, if the delineation of the different component that you want to measure are not entering into a unique box, then you may not probably end up with a good composite because it will mix up things.
Randall? Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, so in looking at the FLAIR OA, and this applies to other composites and such, is whether you can actually measure something reasonably consistently and accurately. The example I'll use for FLAIR is swelling of the knee. So I don't know that many physicians can actually do a good job and be consistent with swelling of the knee, as well as it's going to be difficult if you have someone of different body habitus, because you might be able to detect that better in one group than another. So when you're considering composites and considering what you're going to analyze and look at, you have to also consider how well that can be judged. Now, for me, I'm not going to run a clinical trial where I'm doing MRI or CT scans in people's knees to get volumetric analysis. You may, but I won't. But the whole point is, whatever your measurement is, or whatever you're looking for a domain, can you measure it? Can you measure it consistently in order to show a change or not? And that's the key issue.
Excellent comment. You're right.
I think there are a few people on the floor who wanted to make comments.
Bing's next, I think, and then.
Yeah. My
Andre?
question
Yeah,
is really related to is for the vasculitis. So I think in your composite, the only patient-reported piece was just a global. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So I think, at the end of the day, when you come up with this process that says these are going to be the cut points, it may be important to go back and look at how those cut points correlate to changes in other patient-reported outcomes. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, one of the things that you do want to show is that this degree of response actually makes a difference to the things that patients care about. So you haven't included, and you said it at the beginning, you didn't include all of the things that you need to measure in your clinical trial, but I think you need to look at the consequence of those cut points and what those look like on a broader range of PROs to show that what you are doing is meaningful to patients.
I think, first of all, it's a very good idea. I appreciate that. I think that's a good way to think about it. I also would add, there's another wrinkle with the patient global is we have to make sure we have a clear definition of what it is, and that's often not the case for globals from trial to trial. So I think those are the points. We actually kept bringing in PR, taking them out, including our patients, helped us with that. I would also say that we have, and I think we're going to do, what you said is very good. I wouldn't say that that's the only thing patients care about. Patients care about lots of things, including their disease, and as they know the disease better, they hopefully, when you're with a patient and you take care of that patient or with them, you come to both understand what each other thinks is important, and they begin to understand the disease better. They also care about their disease activity as we measure it. So I think it's a balance. They really don't want to go into kidney failure.
Andre, I think, at the back. Thank you.
I have two questions of factors that could impact on the weighting experience for our stakeholders. I thought the first factor could be the order that the domains are shown. Like, for example, in a questionnaire, the order of questions, and maybe it's something easy to address. Another question was maybe a measurement that could be made prior to asking how would they weight each domain. Like if you responded to a poll, is different than doing a negotiation where you have to negotiate your, those economic and game theories that someone may be, the perception of his own role may make him more attached to his own opinions and the willingness to give up his opinions and listen to the other one. So maybe this could also impact how the weight will be distributed.
Any comment? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good remark. Yeah, indeed. I think you're perfectly right. And we've thought, how could we randomize the order of the domains? But the factors would be the table, the companies, also the composition of the tables. We try to make sure that there are all stakeholders around each table, but we did not control for this. So there are many factors that are influencing this. So I think you're right. And also you're describing some dynamic of the groups in itself, which is well known. Some big voices sometimes have a gain, but they are not necessarily right and not necessarily reflecting the exact representation of the group. So you're right.
Thank you. Robin. And then Alison, and then we need to wrap up.
Yeah, and also to stay in the tutorial mind here, yeah. I would like to make a comment, and I think I'll drag Martin Bors into the consideration as well, because we did some work with Jamie Kirkham. And Jordi, will you do me a favor, stand up? What's wrong with Jordi's costume at this point? There are no core domains left. So people should always remember in their trials to still report the core domains and not just the composite. Just reminding everybody.
Okay. Alison, we'll let Martin make a
Wow,
question.
I'm actually regretting putting my
sorry,
hand up
okay.
when it's the last
No,
point.
I'll let
But
Martin.
I just wanted to follow up on Bing's comment. Like, I understand the value, the importance of a composite measure. And I appreciate from this discussion the complexities with the different methods and options to create that composite measure. I forget who stated that off-cited quote that statistics are numbers with tiers wiped off. And Bing's comment reminded me of that statement, that somehow in that selection of which method to use, we have to make sure that the tiers are still acknowledged.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to respond that the reason for doing the composites are both the statistical reasons, as Martin mentioned, but also some political reasons. That currently in vasculitis, the primary endpoint has been 100% physician-based. We are trying to bring in the patient voice to the primary endpoint. We considered many things. There were some didn't make it, and this is kind of what we ended up with. The patient global in vasculitis loads heavily on pain and fatigue, but I don't know about the cutoffs that you mentioned, Bing, and I will take a look at that.
Martin, thank you.
So I'd just like to make another comment on the weighting, and it obviously it feeds into the next step of actually making the instrument and then putting those weights in. And you really have to look at whether the weights are so important that you have to put them in and weight things differently versus an unweighted sum or average of things, and look how the performance suffers or improves when putting those weights in or not. Because at the end of the day, you want an instrument that's going to be optimized to detect differences between patient groups on different treatments. And putting all these difficult weights in may give you an increase of 1% in efficiency, but the instrument becomes totally, unintelligible, whereas a simple sum might give you the same thing. So when you do the weights, it's great to say, yeah, we did this really complex weighting exercise, so now all the opinions are carefully balanced, etc. And at the end of the day, you end up with a very complex instrument instead of a simple one.
Yeah, I just say, so-called unweighted is weighted. It's just weighted equally.
Yeah, I know.
So
That's why I said simple weight.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hear my voice.
I just promise not to push for it if it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I actually think that the slide is, in the usual OMERACT way, probably backwards, is that we have the questions and the group has the answers.
Very nice. And with that, I think we'll end the question and answers where we have the questions, you guys have the answers. Is that what you're saying? Yes. Very good. All right. I'm just going to wrap it up. We're 42 seconds left. We're going to be 2 minutes over because of Martin's question, but that's okay. I hope you enjoyed this exercise. Again, we went through it just to say that one of the most difficult things to do is the weights, okay? I mean, getting the domains, getting the right instruments to measure the domains, that's a step in itself. But sitting there and waiting, and that's what Martin's last comment was about, I think is what's the word? It's probably the hardest of all the steps. And what we intend to do, so that if you were the 40th person to create a composite, we hope to have a website with the other 39 methods that people have used. So we will share the different methods. We'll share the good points. We'll share the bad points so that you can learn from previous exercises. We also intend to provide, instructional videos and e-learning tools or whatever it may be to help you through that process. And it will be dynamic because, again, those choice of the weights and the way that you get to it can be sometimes very difficult. Now, this whole process is not without complexities, okay? We will and we are building, all the pros and cons, and there are definitely pros and cons. I was fortunately able to sit on the OA flare group when they discuss this, and the vasculitis group when they discuss this, and it's very interesting. The same questions come up. For example, okay, you've got the composite. How do the components of the composite fit with the overall score? And there are methods and there are frameworks that people have developed where they look to see how consistent the scores are relative to the composite, how you can dig into the components of the composite to see what's going on. So that exists. I really like the question that came up about, the individuals that you engage, okay, in developing that composite, the different viewpoints of the stakeholders. And I agree that this is a very complex question, and I do not know how to do it yet, but that could be an agenda item for us now for the future for our steering group on composites, is that, if you got the patients giving totally different weights than, say, other stakeholders, how do we resolve that? The other ones I thought came up interesting was the economic perspective of doing this. And there are methods using qualies and dollies and all those components that the economists use to actually develop a weighting system beyond the ones we've talked about here in terms of regressions and so forth. Thresholds is a big issue. Don't know the answer. And I think that's what I wrote down. So I've taken down all your notes. We will bring this to the steering committee and resolve it. It's on the back of physical functions, so hopefully we get better than 20%. And I think that, I've got one last slide here. There's an interesting group giving out the beads. And so for that, we thank you from each of the 5 presentations that have been made. And we're going to go forward with our steering committee to try to answer some of the questions for you. Okay, so I thank you for that. Yeah.